Podcast, a platform created to entertain, educate, and evolve the modern-day deer hunter. Okay, well, I got us recording now, so we'll just kind of jump into the conversation here. And Hal, I appreciate you taking the time to join me tonight to do this. I want to start with essentially picking your brain on, I started listening to your podcast here. When did you start your podcast, Hal? Was it around July or June?
Yeah, right around there. Yeah, I think we started off doing every other week. So we didn't want to get too overwhelmed until we get our feet wet. So I think we just posted episode 8, I think it would be. So that would be 4 months worth.
Okay. So I know a bit about who you and your guys are and how you hunt, and we're going to get into that. That'll be the meat and potatoes of this. But what I don't know is a little bit of your backstory. So I'm curious as to when did you start hunting? Was it a family thing, or was it something that you took up on your own? And what years did you begin to start deer hunting?
Well, I was fortunate to have a father that would take me even when I was little. I remember going with my father, and it was probably, their fleeting memories because, I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and he would still take me. Might have been once a season, I don't remember. But I'd have a toy gun. I'd lug my toy gun behind my father. We'd go somewhere and sit or whatever. And so I got those memories from there. And then I'd carry a BB gun. And then in Maine, you have to be, you had to be then 10 years old to hunt. And so as soon as I got 10 years old, he gave me his old 30-30 Winchester, and I started hunting with that. And again, I probably might have gone once or twice. I don't remember, but that's when I started. And he would take me when he could. He was always working. He was a truck driver, and he didn't always have a Saturday off, but he took me when he could, and so I was grateful for that. And he wasn't a big. He was not a big dyed-in-the-wool hunter. You know what I mean? He'd putter around. And he'd still hunt around a little bit and sit around a while, and that's how we hunted, and that's all I knew was from what he took me. But when I was younger, because he started taking me hunting, I just got crazy about hunting, and I would hunt anything. Back then we was kids. We lived in a rural area, so we'd take our BB guns and go hunt squirrels and birds or whatever, and then I got into rabbit hunting when I was 10 too. My grandfather had a couple of beagles, and I would go with him every weekend rabbit hunting. And so, anyways, I grew up hunting like that. But southern Maine, that was in southern Maine where I grew up. It was, not a lot of deer. It was where there was less deer. Northern Maine at that time, I'm talking back in the 60s now. Up in the North Maine woods, all of northern Maine, that's where people went to hunt deer. And, people from southern Maine, everybody talked about going north because, like I said, there wasn't very many deer. You was lucky to see a deer in southern Maine. And, but I hunted southern Maine with my father, and when I actually shot my first deer when I was 12. I shot a spike horn. Back then, you could shoot either sex. It didn't matter. He was allowed one deer. and then I shot. I think the next year I shot a doe, and then I missed a year, and then I was I only wounded one in my life, and it was when I was 15. I wounded a nice buck and never got it. And then when I was 16, I got invited to go up to my father's cousins had a hunting lodge kind of further up the coast than us, and I got invited to go there, and I spent a week up there, and then I got to go kind of off on my own, like it was my own, do my own thing, you know. And I just roamed around the woods, and within a year or so, the guys that were all my father's age, they was asking me to, you know, where to go and how we were going to hunt that day and all of that, you know. So I just took to it naturally, I guess. And then I went in the Marine Corps right out of high school, and when I got out of the Marine Corps, I wanted to be a game warden, but they weren't even taking applications. So I said, well, I just got married. I said, I got to support my wife. So I just looked around for a job, and I took a job in a food warehouse, and I worked there for 2 years, and I hated it because I was inside working. It was, you know, kind of enclosed in, but I had a pretty good schedule there where I could, you know, I worked three or 4 days in a row and then had the rest of the time off. And but anyways, after I was there for a year, I got a week's vacation, but I didn't have any seniority, so I couldn't get a week in southern Maine to get down to the family lodge. But I could get a week. It's the northern zone. Back then there was 2 zones, north and south, and the northern zone had they started a week early. So I took that week, first week in November, and I talked my father into going, and we had a little pop-up camper, and we headed north. Didn't even know what we were doing, but we used to go fishing up there, and we always saw some deer and deer tracks up there, so that's where I went. Towed that camper up there like kind of blind, and set the camper up and just started deer hunting. And that year, it was a cold first week that year. It was down in the single numbers at night. We weren't prepared for that. We had a little Coleman stove and a Coleman heater in there, and we like to froze to death. I put my boots on in the morning. I'd have to, you know, get stomping around because they'd be frozen up, no way to dry anything.
Right.
And but long story short of that was the last day there, I shot a spike horn, and so that was my first big woods experience, my first big woods buck. And then from then on, that's the only place I wanted to hunt was up north. The next year, I started going every year for a week up north, and my father wouldn't go the next year because he said till I got better accommodations he wasn't going. So I had a buddy of mine went the next year. We decided we weren't going to shoot anything unless it was a decent buck. So neither one of us shot anything that year. We didn't have any snow either, and then it just led on. We just started going. I got a better camper, and started to be, there was half a dozen of us would go sometimes, and I never hunted down at the relatives' lodge anymore. Something about the big woods that was where I wanted to be to hunt was, you never saw any hunters, and there was lots of woods to roam, and I just got hooked on it, you know. So that's why I tell people, you either love it or you hate it in the big woods. There doesn't seem to be any in between, you know. People can take it or leave it. They always seem to be people that hunt in the big woods. They have their own reasons they like it, and then the other people, it ain't for them, not their cup of tea, and they don't come back. I saw that a lot when I was running my outfitting business. We'd have guys leave Wednesday or Thursday. They wouldn't even finish the week because it just wasn't their thing. That's what they said. They said, it ain't our thing, you know. So kind of crazy. So that was a story, and then I worked at that place 2 years, and then my father-in-law asked me if I wanted to try lobster, and he was a lobster fisherman, and he had been out with back surgery, and he'd been out of it for a year or so, and he was getting back started again, and so I said, yep. So I went down and worked for him for a couple of years, and then I bought my own boat and went on my own, and I went on my own for 9 years with the idea that by then I decided I wanted to be up north, and I wanted to guide and stuff, so I just worked towards that, and then I lobstered for 9 years, and then we pulled up stakes, and I dragged my wife north and my son, and we built a sporting camp. Started guiding and doing the whole thing.
What year? What year would that have been then when you had built your first camp up there?
We built the first one in 1989.
Okay.
And we moved up. We didn't move up then. We built the first camp. And it was actually 2 camps, a duplex. And then in 91, we built a bigger camp that we could live in while we was doing some, while we would keep building. And we just built one at a time and kept going, then built the lodge and moved up into that in 92. And 93 we moved into the lodge. We finished it. So we just kind of built the business and the buildings at the same time. It was a tough road. I didn't think we was going to make it sometimes there, but finally made it and got over the hump, I guess. And
so you're essentially bringing in people to hunt and taking them out and providing accommodations?
Yep. So we did everything. I mean, I picked this area because I got to know it, that it was like a 4 seasons area here. Some places around the state aren't, after deer season they kind of roll up the sidewalks here, but this is a big snowmobile area too, so I knew we could have income from snowmobile, and the fishing's great. It's all native brook trout up this way and salmon, and so that's why we did it that way, where we could have, year-round business. So, but yes, I started doing bear hunts, which our bear season starts the last Monday in August, so we'd have 4 weeks of bear, then we'd have a first moose season, and then we'd have bird hunters and another moose season through October, and then we'd go into the deer season, rabbit hunters and coyote hunters in the winter, and snowmobilers, and just kept busy.
That's great. Deer hunting seems that it was your passion. Just in listening to you talk about it, it seems like you've been pretty consumed about it, or some of those other hobbies have equal part in your love for them.
Yeah, the deer hunting's my main thing. I like moose hunting. I like the other stuff well enough, but I'm just crazy about the deer hunting in the big woods, and I've actually got to the point where it's only really tracking. I like to track so much that I don't even really want to shoot one on the bare ground. I go out and kick around and look for sign and stuff, but I don't get too serious till the snow flies.
How often? Well, your winters must be pretty long up there. I know you're pretty far north. When do you guys start seeing snow? Beginning in November, end of October?
Yeah, we've been having snow here. This year's a little early, but we had 2 inches on the ground this morning. Some of it melted, but actually just east, we were on the edge of it. It moved east of us a little bit, but just down the road 10 miles, it was 5 inches. And we've had flurries for about a week. But typically we can get it any time now. It's calling for 3 to 5 inches this Saturday. But early season, it usually doesn't stay. Like, you got to hit it, because you might have it, you get a few inches, you might have a day or two to hunt on it, and then it melts off, and then it starts again. And then, typically by the middle of November, usually it's staying on for the duration, but every year's a little different.
Did you start off right away with the tracking, or was that, did you start off Well, I mean, I know how you said you got started, but when did you go from like the conventional methods of sitting and still hunting to going to exclusively tracking, and how did that learning curve go?
Well, I started I was tracking rabbits when I was a teenager. We used to a couple of us would go and we'd each track rabbits around for each other. We had snowshoe hares here, and I always liked to track. I'd follow tracks all the time, and when I hunted down to the relatives' lodge down there, it was on the coast, so there was very rarely any snow. But if we got snow down there, I'd always end up following tracks. But when I came up here, that was my intention, was to try to go tracking, because I never had much patience for sitting anyway, so I'd still hunt around, and so I just wanted to track. I don't know, that was what I wanted to do. So, I just started learning it when we had snow. I started following bucks, and it was a learning curve. I tell people when I do seminars and stuff now, everybody kind of, people look at you where you are now. They don't know where you were when you started. You know what I mean? Because a lot of people are just starting, and they want to figure that out. But when I started tracking and getting serious and started hunting up north when I first come up. Now, I didn't have snow every time I came up, but it was 7 years before I shot a buck tracking. But I just kept at it. And I learned, I would catch up to them, and they'd always teach me something, and they'd take me to these places that I learned. And I learned about the deer. One thing about tracking is you learn about what the behavior of those bucks. You don't learn that sitting in a stand. You don't learn the woods. You don't learn anything, really. You might find where there's a scrape you want to sit on, but you're really not learning anything about where a particular buck travels and things like that. So I was always interested in that, And I remember one of the first good ones I got on up there. He took me cross country for, I figure I had topo maps back then. We didn't have all this GPS and all this, but I got my topo map out that night, and I put a string on it and traced where I went on that buck, and it was 15 miles cross country. He never even turned. He just went up over a mountain and down over another one and up over, and he just kept right off in kind of almost one direction. I mean, it might have curved a little bit, but he didn't circle. He kept going. So I learned right then that it was going to be a different deal. These deer weren't in one piece of wood.
Yeah, that's an expansive landscape. I mean, through 15 miles, what is the landscape like up there? I mean, are you encountering logging roads, or is it just just woods?
Well, back then there was a lot less logging roads than there is now, but he did cross. Oh, he crossed, let's see, one old road with barely drivable. Actually, on all that trip, he crossed one decent gravel road on that trip, the way he went, because in the mountains here, there's a lot of places they can't build roads just because of the mountains. But he did cross a few, like old, I call them cart roads, or, you call them wagon roads and stuff where they cut years ago. But other than that, that's all he crossed, really. It was just big woods.
What kind of mileage can you guys get away from, roads where most hunters are using for access? I mean, I hunt some big timber up in northern Michigan, and, you're hard-pressed to get 3 miles from, any type of road. Is it more expansive than that up there?
Well, depends where you go, but around here, there's some places just because of the layout of the land and how they've put the roads. But there's places I can go in. Well, I could walk behind my house where I live. I could walk in one direction if I went like due east behind my house. I think it would be about 8 miles before I ever got to a road somebody could drive on.
Oh,
I
wow.
crossed one snowmobile trail, and then other than that, I wouldn't cross a road that a vehicle could get down.
Okay.
But other places, it's chopped up a lot more from logging, and you might have a road every mile, maybe, in some places. Not usually here, but northern Maine, you get north of me because the terrain levels out a little more. They can build the road straighter.
Mm-hmm.
Then they don't like to skid wood more than like a half a mile. So usually they build a road every mile, then skid wood to it, half a mile each way.
Sure.
But there's so much country up here that doesn't even get hunted that you don't even worry about it. There's places that more hunters go than other places. They get attracted to like the newest cuts and things like that. And then once those cuts grow up, they go somewhere else, and it just rotates around.
Sure.
But I can go most seasons. I never see a hunter in the woods up here. I'm actually usually surprised when I see one.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think it's been 5 or 6 years for myself that I've actually encountered, another person out while I was hunting, just because of the expansive landscape, really.
Yeah, and the other reason really is, I'll tell you, the main reason you don't run into people here is because they don't go in that far. I mean, I've been teaching people how to hunt in the big woods for years, and there's still, most people don't get more than a quarter of a mile from a road.
Yeah.
They're afraid of it. That's why I talk a lot about that fear in my newest book. I got a whole chapter on the system I developed, and the whole thing starts out with that: is if you're not comfortable in the woods, you're never gonna hunt, right in the big woods. You go and put a stand in somewhere, but if you're gonna track, you can't be afraid of the woods at all.
I wonder if that will change now with the, most people have just the application on their phone where through their GPS they can know exactly where they are and look at a layout of the landscape. Heck, I even have a watch now that has a compass on it, and I can set a waypoint. You'd be real hard pressed to be able to get lost out there, and I think that adds a lot of comfort. So I wonder if more and more people will be apt to take that on, or if there's still just a deep-rooted fear for people. Because, boy, yeah, once, especially if you get into swamps and stuff where you just can't see real far, it certainly has a way different feel to it.
Yeah, it might help some people, and I think maybe some of the next generation coming along, there's a lot of these younger guys now that are in their 20s that they kind of like into extreme sports and stuff. I think those are the ones that are more likely to take it up. But I remember when the GPS first came out, I said, geez, everybody's going to get in now, It didn't change a thing.
Oh, okay.
They're still scared of the woods. Yeah, I mean, it's comfort for them, I think, but they're still, if they're by themselves,
sure.
A lot of people, it's a human trait, fear of the dark, fear of the woods, and some people have trouble overcoming that, and the only way you can overcome it is just to do it,
Well, I can attest to it. I remember being a young boy and going up north to deer hunt, and when it got dark, or when I had to walk out, to a place by myself in the dark, it was a somewhat terrifying thing, and it took years and years of being out there and building my comfort to now where I look forward to that more than anything of the whole year, taking a tent and going out there and finding somewhere remote to get a good night's sleep, Yeah,
you overcame it, and most people are like that. It's kind of, ironically, I never had that fear. I never gave it a thought. I never was uncomfortable in the woods, and I never had that thought. And it might have been because I ran around in the woods for the time I was 5 or 6 years old. My mother, in the summertime, I just had to be back for supper, and I was in the woods all the time. And I started hunting with rabbits with my grandfather at 10 years old. I didn't stay with my grandfather. We split up, and I'd find him. If I'd go find his snowshoe track and catch up to him, and I never ever really felt that way. And even when I went north the first time, I hunted 2 years up here in the big woods before I even thought about having a compass. Think about that. I never even had a compass. I got a natural sense of direction, and I never felt like I was going to be lost or any of that. And then one time I was in that second year, it started snowing, and I was down in a big piece of woods, and I said, well, it was getting late in the afternoon. I said, well, I'll head up. And I headed out, and I walked for about a half an hour, and the next thing I know, I see a boot track in the woods, and I'm thinking, who the heck is this? And I start looking at it, and I'm like, that's my boot track, you know. I'd walked in a circle. And then I figured that out then. What happened was everybody tends to turn one way if they're going around something. Like if you come to a thicket, you got to go right or left to go around it.
Sure.
And if you keep pulling one way, you'll pull right in a circle. So to keep a straight line, if you go right around one thing, go left the next time, then go right, then go left, and then you'll walk a straighter line, you know.
I can't believe you did no compass. That to me seems pretty unique.
Yeah, I never had one, never thought about it until that time. And then I said, you know, I better get a compass because, you know, if it's snowing or something, I want to get out a straight line pretty quick. I'll have a compass. So I got a compass because of that, you know. And I carry actually two now because I started carrying one that I could use on a map, you know, on a regular mapping compass, you know.
Sure.
And I carry that in my pack. And then I carry just a directional compass in my pocket. It's got the degrees on it, but it doesn't have a movable bezel. It's just a little, the one I got, I think it might be a silver one or something, but it's about the size of $50, and I just carry it in my pocket. You know, it's smooth. I mean, I got days I don't even take it out of my pocket, you know.
Is some of that a product of the landscape there with the mountains and the terrain features being able to navigate? Because I feel like there's some spots where I go where it's just miles and miles of everything looks exactly the same. I would really struggle with that.
Yeah, it is the land. A lot of it's the landscape. With the ridges, you can, you know, if you went up one ridge or one side of one mountain, you got to come down the other way, right?
Right.
So it is easier to navigate in the mountains and the high ridges, and because we have places around here too in the valley that's a big huge places of that real flat ground with beaver bogs in it, and you get turned around in there too.
Right.
But yeah, definitely it's easier when you've got the terrain. But that being said, you know, you might be on a ridge or a mountain, and it isn't necessarily running the same way all the time. You know, the ridges turn, they get wrinkles in them and 90-degree corners in some of these ridges. So it's easier, but it's not, you know, in the snow or something, it's not necessarily that easy. So now I hunt a lot of places if I've never been before, and the GPS is a handy tool. I tell people don't rely on it and all this stuff because it's electronic gadget and it can fail, you know. Your compass will never fail you.
Sure.
So the GPS to me is more or less if I go into a new place, if I find when I leave my truck into a new spot or I pick up a track from a road when I'm driving somewhere, I just mark the truck and take off, you know. And then later in the day I can just punch it in and see how far I am, and that tells me, you know, how much time I got to cut to get back out of the woods, you know.
Sure. When obviously you're talking about how you navigate these woods, and this will be a bit of a broad statement. We can break it down as far as you want, but in general, is there a way that the deer navigate these? I mean, is it just point A to point B, or do they like terrain features as well, right?
Oh yeah. There's always places when they travel in rough terrain. They have like saddles in the ridges and around the edge of bogs. Instead of walking through the middle of a bog, a swale. They have their places they travel, and some of them you'll see actually develop kind of a game trail, because there isn't a lot of game trails here because the deer wander so much. They don't really stay on trails like they do in a lot of places. So, but they get pinched into some places, and you'll see a trail where they file through a notch between two bluffs or something, and then they fan out and go their own way again.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there's ways they travel, and typically deer travel the path of least resistance, believe it or not. I mean, them bucks can crawl and go through some real crap, but in their normal travel patterns, it's kind of the path of least resistance. They don't want to walk through real big thickets. They don't go up steep ground just to go up it, you know what I mean? They just have their ways of traveling.
Yeah, I've always been led to believe, people use the term that deer are lazy, and I never looked at it that. It takes a lot of energy to survive in the wild, and I always looked at them at they like to conserve energy and not use it for reasons that they don't need to,
Yeah, and if you look at it another way, and if you just took the big picture of it, and if you followed a buck for 4, 5, 10 miles, whatever you went, and then you looked and see how he traveled through those ridges, it really is just a natural way to go. It's the shortest distance to get to where he wants to go, because it doesn't make any sense to crawl up over a steep ridge to just go down the other side.
Sure.
They just flow naturally with the terrain.
Right. So they'll go up to 15 miles without making a stop. You've witnessed that, huh?
Well, not to say they don't stop. I mean, they may.
But to lay down in bed and.
They may bed down. Well, I've followed them. Well, I don't know if I'd followed one that far, but they could go a long ways without laying down.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on the time of year it is. If it's this time of year, the early season, they don't typically go as far because those big bucks are saving themselves for the rut, and they go out and check things out, and they don't typically go a long ways every day. Later in the year, when the rut's winding down, those big old bucks are looking for that last doe. That's when they'll just get out and travel, and they just go and go. And if you don't put your head down and go, you may never catch up to them all day where they went in the night. They're just so frantic about finding the next doe,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, I don't know, if I say you're stereotypical deer hunter that hunts a property, a small property or something, that they get a deer on a game camera or whatever, and they assume that deer's in the area and it's not going far and it's right around there. But yeah, you get up into the big woods and you get a deer on a game camera, you might not ever see that deer again, right?
Yeah, that's right. Like, I've been playing around with the trail cameras for several years now, and usually if I put one out for the whole deer season, like I might put it out late October and then pick it up after the deer season or early December, so something like that. It might be out 5 or 6 weeks. I might only get the same buck on that once on that trail camera, and I usually put them on Signpost rubs, So that tells me how far that buck's traveling, or that he just gets through these areas. Some of the places he goes, he doesn't spend much time there, but he travels through to get somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
And it's typically as the bucks get older, they start expanding their territory more and more because they want to breed more does, so they're going to go looking for more,
So you've seen that the older they get up there, the more they will cover ground and travel, because I know a lot of guys talk to, on properties, smaller properties, and in farmland that a deer, as he gets older, will kind of shrink his core range as he finds like a comfort area in a place that he's not frequently encountering danger. But as they get older up there, they'll start to travel more, you believe?
Yeah, but the difference is around the farm country and stuff is those deer have, they have contact with humans. There's way more does. They don't need to go as far to breed anyways.
Right.
Yeah. And up here, a lot of it will depend on their range, will depend on the deer densities, how many does there are, because it's not a given that there's a certain amount of deer everywhere. There's places you can follow a buck through for a mile or two and never see another deer track. And then all of a sudden he gets into another little pocket of deer and there's some does there and fools around there for a while and strikes off again, and it's another half a mile or a mile before there's another deer.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
That's why they're traveling that far in some places, and other places they don't travel as far.
If we're talking more specifically just to the rut, like, is your rut kind of line up with ours, like end of October to December, pretty much the month of November? I feel like I see rut activity here. Is it a little different there?
Well, I guess I might define the rut differently than a lot of people do. I define the rut as when the bucks are when the does are breeding, they're ready.
Sure.
Not pre-rut and post-rut. I don't think about any of that. I think about when they're actively breeding.
Mm-hmm.
And here, that's the 15th to the 30th every year. You can mark it on your calendar.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's always going to be a few early and there'll always be a few late, but 90% of it probably is done in that 2-week period.
Right. Yeah, I'd say the same thing for the area that I hunt. It's and which lines up with our firearm opener here in the state is November 15th, and it seems like it's haywire from then till the end of November. Have you ever witnessed or seen any activity? I had a thing happen to me a year ago where I was up there like December 15th. About a month later for our late muzzleloader season, and there must have been a couple does in the area that were in heat because there was just bucks running around, and I'd never witnessed that before. Have you ever seen anything like that? Like, I know the magazines every now and then will write an article about the late rut. Yeah,
the does that don't get bred, they'll come in 30 days later.
Yep.
And there's places where the buck to doe ratio, we don't worry about it up here. They almost all get bred that first time. But sometimes they say, though, that a doe fawn will come into heat at 6 months, which will be in December for them.
Right.
But, that happens, but not so much here just because the buck to doe ratio here is fairly balanced,
Sure. So most of that buck activity revolves around doe activity in those in that month or that last 2 weeks of November. Is it what dictates where the does are? Is it just strictly food?
Yep. The does always go to where the good feed is. They take their fawns there to get them fattened up for winter, and so they seek out the best feed, and then the bucks just travel from doe to doe. It's like it's like they know where every doe is in their territory. It's like, I got to go see Susie today, and after that I'm going to go over and see Mary. They just, that's what they do. I know a lot of people think that the bucks and the does meet up at a scrape, but that don't happen up here. They make scrapes and all that, but the odds of I've been, almost 40 years now, and I don't know as I've ever found where I saw a doe track waiting around to scrape, and then a buck come along, and they both walk off together, you know.
Sure.
That buck can find that doe. He knows right where she lives, and he can come in there and smell her out in about 2 seconds. And sometimes they pass through the area, and they don't even stop because he could tell she's not ready. He just keeps on going and makes his circuit till he catches up to one that is. And that's what they do. They just travel those miles on end. They just feed a little bit as they go. They don't. The only time they stop to feed is if they finally go to lay down for a few hours, and they'll feed before they lay down, and then get up and go again.
When they do find a doe that's ready to breed, what do they typically spend, a day or two with them, and then they're on their way, or is it more of a half a day thing, or is it different all the way around?
No, I guess it's probably, I would say they spend a day or so with them because, sometimes I found where I could see where they've caught up, and then the next day go back in and he's still there. But I don't think it's ever more than, it's never more than 2 days. I think if they spend 24 hours with them, they're pretty much done,
Sure. Are the younger bucks just, you gotta counter, for all the mature buck tracks that you encounter and that you're on a track of, is there, it seems like when I'm hunting up there, I'm constantly coming across, year and a half old bucks. Do you have a lot of those around? Do they follow the kind of the same patterns as the older deer, or do they do things completely different?
No, there's plenty of them around. You got your 1.5s, your 2.5s. You got all the age groups mixed in, but myself, I'm typically just focused on the big ones, and I don't even glance at the other ones. So, but yes, they'll, the small ones, the young deer, the young bucks are actually learning to be big bucks from the older bucks. And it seems kind of strange, but a lot of times those older bucks, they tolerate those year-and-a-half olds because they're no threat to them, But those young bucks will actually travel where the big ones do, and they'll go to the same signposts, and that's how they learn the area too. It's got to be because I've got lots of trail camera pictures and films, videos with a yielding buck at a signpost rub, and he finds it by following the older bucks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I actually got one last year. I got one, it's actually a button buck, and he's not with his mother, he's by himself, and he's at a signpost rub, and on the same one I got a picture of this button buck, a spike horn, and 2 big bucks, both well over 200, one's over 250. I just posted that this week on the Big Woods Facebook page. It's what I call a legit 250-pound buck, and I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's he's rubbing a brown ash, a signpost rub there, and he's talking right into it. And you can see he's a monster,
That's awesome. When you're talking about those signpost rubs, I know they play quite a bit different part in a deer's behavior than just a rub where they're working their velvet off in the later part of summer or maybe just marking up their territory. Those are, well, I'd like you to break that down a little bit because you mentioned the ash tree too, and the signpost rubs, they'll actually select certain trees depending on the area as well, won't they?
Yeah, they do, and I can't tell you why. I speculate the reason for the trees they select is I think it's a combination of that they hold scent, and they're a tree that's out of the ordinary per se. In other words, it's not as common of a tree in the woods because no matter where you go, it always seems to be that type of tree is less common. Not always. I shouldn't say that, because some areas they'll signpost a hemlock, and that's fairly common, but it isn't as common as maple, beech, birch. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's least common, and then once you get south of, you got to get down south of Maine, and I don't know if you have red cedar, but red cedar is another one. I found a signpost, several of them down in Tennessee, turkey hunting signposts on red cedar. But in northern Maine, the Adirondacks, anywhere in the north where there's brown ash, I call it. It's really the real name in a book is black ash. If you looked in a tree book, but it's brown ash. It grows in the wet ground, and you might find it up on the mountains and anything, as long as it's wet. It has to have a lot of water, and grows right in the spring seeps and along streams and stuff like that. And that's I'd say even 95% of the signpost rubs up here in northern Maine and across northern, New Hampshire, right up in the boreal forest, is going to be on a brown ash. Once in a while it's a cedar, once in a while it's a spruce, but very, very rare. It's almost always brown ash.
Do you think that those occur in a place where the features of the land are just having those deer naturally travel? They're not going out of their way, obviously, to find somewhere to a signpost. It's typically going to be in a spot where a lot of deer are converging just because they're naturally traveling through there?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a lot of deer, because sometimes there'll be a signpost. There's only one buck using it. That's just it's where he's traveling through, maybe. But most often, the signposts are in a place where territories overlap, different bucks,
Sure.
And sometimes different bucks rub the same one, and sometimes there'll be a signpost rubbed from one buck, and 10 feet away there's one that's another buck, and sometimes they rub them both. I haven't got it all figured out yet, but the trail cameras are helping me figure it a little bit. I kind of watch on which bucks are hitting these signposts and try to figure it out, but most often it's where they overlap territories, because that's what it is. I coined that term years ago because that's the only thing I could think of was they're putting their sign on it, and it's also visual. They can see that as a visual cue, and but I think that corky bark on the brown ash holds their scent better.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't rub them every time they go by either. A lot of people think that they have to go to it and rub it every time, but they don't. I've tracked bucks by signposts, and they never even stop, but it's because it's in their route they're traveling anyways.
I see. Yeah, that's just their call, them letting everybody else in the area know that they live in the neighborhood, huh?
Yeah, all animals mark by scent. All animals do. Bobcats do. Bears do. Bears, you'll see pictures of bears or places in the woods where they rub their backs on, a lot of times, be a spruce or a pine tree, and then they bite the bark to show how tall they are. That's how a bear marks his territory. But all animals communicate by scent, and they mark a certain way, and so the deer do too.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I started scouting some, finding places on maps that I assumed that people wouldn't be, or there'd be way lower hunter density, and I've encountered a few of these areas where I'm finding rubs that you can just tell that for years that tree's been getting worked over, and that's similar to what you're talking about with the signposts, right? They just historically, like generations of deer will, for whatever reason, gravitate to that tree, that area, and use them over and over again.
Yeah. What kind of trees are they out there?
To tell you the honest truth, I'm just getting to the spot where I'm starting to pay attention to that. I've found them in a few different areas on a few different trees, but it wasn't until I really heard you talk about the the black ash and then being on different things in different areas where I need to revisit some of these spots and pay attention to what kind of trees these actually are and see if I can confirm that for my area too, where they're choosing trees. But I will say that a lot of times it does seem like they're picking conifer trees, like especially ones that are maybe 4 to 6 inches in diameter, and I'd heard that as well, that they like those trees that when they really rake them down and get some sap coming out of there. I find very often that I'll find a lot of hair in the sap around those rubs, and it must be from them rubbing their faces against that and just trying to embed their scent inside that. And I imagine that sappy material really holds the really probably.
Yeah, there's got to be a reason. That's like I said. I speculate that it's a combination of it's an odd tree, and it holds scent better. And I found signposts that usually a lot of signposts are actually started when that on a brown ash I've seen it. I can tell it was started when that might be only an inch in diameter, like a sapling almost. And if it lives, a lot of times they kill those little ones because they end up rubbing the bark all the way around it and then it dies. But if it survives, they'll keep rubbing that every year. And I've actually found big ones that are, say, 10 inches in diameter and rubbed on both sides, but you can look right straight through the middle of the tree. It's rotted through the middle because it was rubbed when it was small. And a lot of the other ones you can see, if you can look into the tree, way into the beginning of the tree, like it's rubbed so it looks like half of the tree is missing and the bark keeps trying to, grow out around it, then that's an old signpost that's been rubbed for generations. I found one, well, I've been looking at it for a lot of years, but I revisited a couple of years ago and put a camera on it, and then I put it again last year, but it's down along a stream, and it was kind of funny. I got 3 or 4 bucks on it last fall, and then the winter time came, and the beavers cut it down, and so they cut it right down. So I went in this spring with my snowmobile, and I cut it off, and I dragged it out, and I got it down in my man cave now. But I cut when I cut the tree off, I don't know, 6 feet, 5, 6 feet above the rub. That tree was 80 years old.
Really?
Because they don't get very big. They grow slow anyways. And when they're rubbing it, it's half, they're scarring it, so the tree is not very healthy,
Right.
But that thing had 80 years, and I believe by looking at how far into it, it had to have been being rubbed for 60 years. You think about that, how many bucks have rubbed that? If you could only have a picture of all the bucks that ever rubbed that signpost, it would be something else, I think.
When do you think that that's like you're finding those in like what people would call like their core area where like a buck spends a majority of his time, or how do they select those areas? Is it just based on travel patterns, or?
Yes, that's what it's based on. Because these bucks up here, they don't have a core area. I mean, their core area might be, 10 miles in either direction.
Right.
And they're in part of that territory at some time, but they don't. You gotta, when you hunt up here, you in the big woods, you gotta forget about finding feeding and bedding areas, because that don't happen here. They travel in huge circles, and when they're ready to lay down, they lay down. Now, I think they've got certain places they like to lay in their territory, and I know they do because I found beds before. I've jumped bucks out of beds, and I go and look at the bed, and it looks like a bathtub almost. It's so deep from laying in there over the years. There'll be old dried up droppings in it and stuff. But that buck, it's his spot. When he gets to that place, that's where he'll lay. But he ain't going to be there every day. He might be there once a week, you know. You never know when he's going to be there. But so they pick a place that they got a good vantage point. So there's certain places they do like to stay, but you can't. Basically, I guess I'm trying to say is you're not going to pattern a buck to say he's going to come here every day back and forth.
Right.
Doesn't work.
Yeah,
So,
I've seen that too, you know, where you get a deer on a camera and then the next time you see him on a camera is 15 days later, and it's like, how are you supposed to you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem possible.
And again, the problem with the cameras is I tell people don't put so much faith in those trail cameras, because if that buck walks, you know, if you got it on a specific trail, what I find here is the bucks don't like to walk in a trail anyways. If there's a trail, they walk off to the side of it. So that buck could come by there every few days, but he doesn't necessarily get on the camera. You know what I mean? He's out of range of the camera or something.
Right, yeah.
So you can't really go by that. But I always figured, and I wrote about this, that on average, those big old bucks travel their territory, it's about 3 to 4 days before they get back around to the same area again.
Okay.
It seems to be, because I could tell by going and looking at where I pick up tracks, you know, if I don't see a track there for a couple days, the odds are he's going to be there that day. You know what I mean? It's just the way it happens, you know.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've never had a scenario. I mean, I've never done any tracking personally. You know, I've done a lot of hunting in the big woods, but it's typically on a tree stand or in a blind or just sitting on a stump. And I've never seen the same deer, like, you know, over and over again, or a day or two. Maybe a 1.5 year old buck. But other than that, yeah, it's like usually one and done for me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, back when I first started guiding and stuff for years, I mean, right through that earlier years, my hunters, my clients were like, I called them like my guinea pigs, because I could have them sit somewhere where I never had the patience to sit, and that's how I learned how to pick places to sit, you know, signpost rubs, annual scrapes. I mean, all these things added up, because I'd put people there and they'd shoot bucks there, you know.
Sure.
And it might take them a whole week. They might sit there a whole week and finally shoot a buck there, but doesn't matter, you know.
Right. That's what it might take, is a week, huh? Just sitting in the same spot all day, every day, and then you might get one.
And you might never see another deer. That's the thing. If you get down into some of them places where there's signposts, if there's no does around, you may never see another deer there. Right. Till that buck comes along, you know. And it gets discouraging for people, you know.
Yeah.
But that's the reality of it, you know.
Yeah. You were just talking about scrapes. You know, when you're following a deer around, are they doing the same thing with scrapes? Are they just leaving those to mark their territory, or is it a overlapping area where a lot of deer are communicating? Or are you usually finding those in conjunction with a signpost rub?
Well, what I figured out over the years, and I've written about this on my second book, I wrote this, I broke it down more. I broke the scrapes and rubs both down into 3 categories. And the rubs would be, since we already talked about rubs, would be, you got your signpost rub. Those are the ones made every year. You got your common rub is the ones I call, they're common, right? They're just rubbed on some tree somewhere. and they'll never get rubbed again. And then the other one I call it a hooking. It's when they just thrashing around in the brush, and usually it's out of frustration. And most of those are made during the rut. They get into a willow bush or something and just rack it around. And then the scrapes, there's 3 scrapes. There's pawrings. That's what I call pawrings. And those are the ones you might look down a ridge and you might see 10 of them in a row.
Sure.
But they're just kicked up. The buck makes a couple of swipes and kicks the leaves out.
Yep.
And keeps moving.
Yep.
The only thing that tells you is that buck went by there. And he probably will come by again sometime, but it doesn't mean anything else. And then you have what I think I just call them the common scrapes. And those are usually made near where the does are that year. Because the does aren't necessarily the same place every year. Sometimes they are for maybe a bunch of years. But so those rubs, when the bucks get near where the does are, they make those scrapes. It's just an instinct to do it near the does. And then the other scrape, that to me is the real important one, I call it an annual scrape. And those scrapes are made in the same place every year. It's almost like a signpost, but it's a scrape.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those are dug right down into the roots of the trees, and they might be, I've seen them like 6 inches deep where they've dug the dirt out over the years. And up here, those are usually associated with a spruce or a fir limb overhanging, And you'll see old dead limbs around on the ground where they broke the limbs off with their horns, and putting scent on them. They call them licking branches or whatever.
Yep.
Those annual scrapes are more important because those are right where they're traveling.
Okay.
They're coming by. If you find that and you find a signpost near it and you're a sitter, you got your good place to sit.
Yeah. Okay. That's great information. Do those line up with anything like topography-wise or landscape-wise? Are you finding them in the similar areas, or do they vary?
They vary. I've never found really much of a rhyme or reason to those scrapes, but sometimes they are fairly close to a signpost rub. So in other words, they might get down in a bottom there and there's some brown ash, and they rub those, and then maybe within even 50 yards, there might be one of these annual scrapes all kicked out. Mm-hmm. That's a hot spot right there. A lot of bucks coming through there.
Yeah.
So,
what was the first one? What did you call that? A paw?
Just pawing, Pawing.
Yep.
They just paw the ground. That's all they're doing is pawing at the ground.
Yeah, I know.
There's nothing to it.
I know exactly what you're talking about because I could walk a ridge top and come across 12 of those,
Yeah. I mean, it tells you a buck was there.
Right.
But the importance of it's not really significant,
Right. Yeah, I had heard someone else say that a lot of times they thought those were just like you said about the little rubs. Sometimes those were just out of frustration. If there's a doe and heat in the area and there's multiple bucks, that they'll be in there just kind of clawing at the ground out of frustration. But it's definitely marking a travel pattern, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they went there. But the other thing is when these bucks go through their territories, they don't necessarily go the exact same place every time. I mean, they might, if they're traveling across the ridge down through a valley, I mean, their route might take them a couple hundred yards apart each time. You know what I mean? They don't have to walk in the same spot every time. I call those like it's more like a travel corridor. That's the corridor they use, but it's not necessarily they're stepping in the same tracks every time.
Interesting.
I think a lot of that's to do with, it seems to be when they're in a hurry, they cut a lot of corners. If they're trying to make time and get to these does, they cut a lot of corners out. When they're just going through their normal pattern, it's like maybe earlier in the season, they make a point to go to their signposts and look at them, or go to those scrapes and look at them. But when they're after them does, they're just trying to get point A to point B to see if that doe's ready, you know?
Sure. Have you ever seen a correlation with their movement patterns with like weather, or guys even talk about moon phase? Is that anything that you've ever been able to observe a pattern with them?
The weather is, to me, up here, the weather is the only thing that controls their movement.
Mm-hmm.
The moon has got zero to do with it. And matter of fact, I just, a couple of years ago, and I got it on my computer somewhere, it was a study done by the New Brunswick Fish and Wildlife, and they did this study with wild collared deer. They collared bucks and does both and stuff. And what they were trying to do was to figure out the moon phase on breeding, because I think that Charles Alzheimer come up with some theory about how the rut revolved around the moon phase, and he had a formula for it.
Mm-hmm.
And what this study did, and it was peer-reviewed by 18 states and provinces, and the conclusion was the moon has nothing to do with the rut. But coincidentally, in that study, they also found that they didn't see where the moon had anything to do with feeding times either, feeding patterns. So I never believed in the moon myself anyways, because at least up here, because I can't tell you anything about farm country or any of that stuff, but the weather is the controller. You know, if you've got warm weather, they don't move as much. They move more at night. If you've got cold weather, they'll move all day, and it's just the nature of it. If you've got a snowstorm, they settle down. You know, there's sometimes you'll pick up a buck track during a big snow, but not often. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's always the weather, and changing weather is another good one. If the pressure systems change, or you go from, you know, a warm pattern into the temperature drops, and the cold weather starts in. If that happens in the middle of the day, they'll jump up right in the middle of the day and start moving. So it's always the weather.
So changing fronts, whether one's ending or beginning, you know, you always hear people talk about, you know, the barometric pressure change if a front's coming in or out. But typically they're trying to seek shelter during a front, but they'll move before or after.
Yeah, I guess so. It depends on how much of a storm it's going to be, and I believe that's how they know, is they have to sense the pressure. And if it's, you know, when we get a big storm, a big snowstorm or something, the pressure is lower, so they might feed, you know, they're going to feed before that and then get hunkered in. And it doesn't mean they won't get up during it, because I've found a lot of times tracking that, you know, a buck will get up and he might feed around, you know, 20 yards in a circle right around there and lay back down.
Sure.
But they typically don't go very far, you know what I mean?
Okay.
But and the does are the same way. They'll get up and feed in a storm, but they just get up and stretch their legs and feed around and lay right back down.
Right. Yeah, they're not trying to cover any kind of ground in that weather, but
no, they feel vulnerable. You got to remember, the deer is trying to save their skin all the time, and if they're out in a snowstorm with the wind blowing and everything, they can't see nothing, they can't hear nothing, they can't smell nothing, so they're vulnerable, you know.
Yeah. Do you think they move more on those days? I mean, I don't know if it's a product of just the fact that my senses are more keen. I mean, I do and don't hate those evenings and mornings where there's no wind and there's crisp leaves and you can hear deer coming for a long ways. But have you ever? Well, I mean, you're typically doing this when there's snow on the ground. But I just wondered if there was if you saw a correlation between like having dead still days versus having a little bit of wind, or what makes them the most comfortable.
Well, I don't think it makes a lot of difference here. If it's bare ground and crunchy leaves, I'm sure they like it when they can hear everything. When there's no wind, but they move around in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe as much or maybe not as much, but I don't think it bothers them all that much. Unless it depends what you call wind. There's a difference between a 10-mile-an-hour wind and a 40-mile-an-hour wind.
I do know. I sat in a 40-mile-an-hour wind this weekend. It wasn't much fun.
Yeah, I don't see where they move too much and stuff like that. That makes them vulnerable. But a regular kind of a windy day where the trees are shaking a little bit and the leaves are flickering, that doesn't bother them any.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen any kind of correlation with their travel patterns as far as the way the wind's blowing? I mean, traveling into the wind or out of the wind, or...
No, the wind blows 4 directions every minute up here.
Yeah, it does. The same place where I hunt.
Yeah, well, I get asked the question all the time. If you're tracking a buck, what happens if the wind is behind you? And I go, you just keep moving because he's going to smell you all the time, and eventually he'll have to turn. You can't walk with the wind all the time.
Right.
But yeah, they don't walk into the wind. I know. I for a fact, quite often one of them wise old bucks will put the wind. He'll put the wind behind him, and then that way he can smell what's behind him.
Right.
He can see what's ahead of him, and he can smell what's behind him. Because I've followed him, and you'll read it right in the snow, where he's just walking along. Then all of a sudden, you'll see where he takes 3 or 4 jumps and starts walking fast because the scent got too strong for him.
Sure.
And then he'll slow down again, and then maybe another half a mile or a mile later, you see the same thing. He picked up his pace a little bit. You got too close, But when I'm tracking, I stay on him because eventually it's going to change. You know what I mean? The wind's going to change, or he's got to change direction or something,
Right. Do you think that they use that wind like when they're trying to locate does as well? I mean, I imagine obviously their nose is their most strongest sense. They're not just trying to walk around and ID them visually, right? I mean, they're trying to find them with their nose.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's how they do. That's how they do it, anyways. Is their scent check, and they don't have to go right to the doe and see her. I've seen where they've like walked out onto a little pinnacle where there's a big bowl down below, and they walk out there and you see where they stood there for a while, and then turned 90 degrees and went off in another direction, and they were standing there winding for does. Because when I get there, I'm like wondering why they did that, and then it dawns on me the wind is coming, right from that bowl right into my face, and I'm like, he just stood here and scent checked for a while and then just moved on. I've seen that 100 times.
Mm-hmm. So a guy that's looking to potentially set up, to sit, that'd be another spot too, right? Like downwind sides of doe bedding areas and cuts and things like that. Have you seen them travel like the downwind sides of cuts and?
Yes, but the problem with that is you don't know what the wind is going to be when you get in there. Anyways, it's crazy here. You can't.
Right.
If you've got a good stiff wind like a prevailing up here, it's northwest, west northwest. If you got a prevailing wind, you could take that into account. But you could go sit down anywhere on a still morning and you watch your breath, and then and 1 minute it's blowing one way, and then the next minute it's blowing the opposite way.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that's a lot of chance to try to think you're setting up on the downwind side of a doe area, because those does aren't going to stay in the same spot either. You know, where the does are, like say a doe, the does are typically got a smaller area, but they can travel pretty good too. Like they might come down off of one side of one mountain, cross a valley, and go up on the other side and stay there for a few days too. They're not necessarily like right in a spot where you could see them all the time. You know, they don't stay that close. I mean, it's just I think a lot of that might depend on the weather, and I also think it's probably because what controls the deer behavior up here is coyotes. So they get chased around by coyotes all the time. So they might feel if they stay on one ridge for more than a few days, they're more susceptible. So they just take a little walkabout and they move a half a mile and go over there for a while, you know.
Sure. Well, you must have to take account. I mean, if you're setting guys up, like you talked about on signpost rubs and things of that nature, to sit for a couple days, do you take that wind direction into account? I know exactly what you're talking about. It blowing 4 different directions in 3 minutes. It's a frustrating thing that I deal with all the time. It drives us crazy. But you know, how are you going about positioning a guy if he's on a spot, you know, to hunt?
Well, I would always, I never even used tree stands back when I was guiding and before I started doing my one-on-one tracking hunts. I would have 3 or 4 guys, and I would just build ground blinds for them. But I'd build the blinds like on the, you know, the downwind side of always build them for the prevailing wind, because that's the way it's going to be most of the time.
Yep.
And then always keep in mind that the wind isn't going to blow that far anyways. I mean, if you've got a spot where you can see a little ways and you keep on the prevailing side of it, I mean, there's still, I'm not saying they'll never smell you, but if you got a place where you can see off 50, 60, 70 yards, you're probably going to see that buck anyways. Because if the wind blows hard, it doesn't get very far before it dissipates. The worst thing, really, more than wind is when it's still and you just have the thermals drifting along steady, you know.
Right.
That seems to be worse.
Right.
But
those are somewhat predictable.
Yeah, but you can't take everything into account. All I knew from doing it for so many years was if you put a guy in a good spot and he sat there long enough, he had a pretty good chance of killing a buck, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
But it could take up to a week for deer to come through there, which...
Yeah, it might, and it might be the first day.
Right, that's
true.
true.
Another picture I just posted on my Facebook page was it was a young guy from Pennsylvania, his first trip up. He came up with his father and another guy. They were in camp. And I'd found this hot spot down in these cedar bogs. The week before, we'd had a little snow. And I found this really cool spot where there was a bunch of brown ash rubs and a signpost. And then about 40, 50 yards from it, an annual scrape under a spruce. And it was down in there, because it was boggy, soft ground, you could see trails, you know. And there was a kind of a big boulder, about 30 yards from the trail in between them, with some little fir trees on it. I made a little blind out of that, and I had a guy in there. I found it like on a Wednesday. So Thursday and Friday, I took a guy in there. No, Friday and Saturday. For 2 days, a guy sat there. I'd take him in the morning. I had ribboned the trail, and then he'd come out for lunch, though. He'd come back out. We were going by boat back then up in a remote camp, and he'd come back out for lunch, and he'd go back in the afternoon, and he didn't see nothing. So the next group that come in on Sunday, I said, if I need to take a guy in this place, but he's got to commit to sitting there all day, every day. And this young fella piped up and said, yeah, I can do that, because he was used to it. He bow hunted in Pennsylvania, so he was used to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I took him in there, and at right around 11 o'clock that first Monday morning there, he shot this buck in there, which was the biggest buck that I ever had a guy shoot. It dressed 245, and it grossed 184.
Oh, my gosh.
And just, you know, he sat there. He didn't come out for lunch, and not to say the buck went by there every day. The guy was gone at lunch. I know he didn't, but he committed to it, and he got one the first day. You know, other guys would be the last day. So
yeah,
you get a good spot, you got to commit to it. Instead of playing, I used to call it, guys would want to move every day and call it musical stands, and it never works out as good if you do that.
Yeah, I think it's conflicting information, because a lot of what people hear is relevant to the small acreage and the farm hunting, where they tell you, you know, you can only sit a spot 1 or 2 times, and then you've kind of burned that spot and you need to move. But up there, and you know, you've said it as well as other people that I've spoke with that hunt the big woods, you know, that deer might only be coming through every 3 days or once a week or even less than that. So if you're not going to sit your butt in that seat and spend the hours there, how do you think you're going to see them?
Yeah. The other thing I tell people about the hunting bucks in the big woods, it's a different animal, because you can't, if you've hunted in the farm country all your life, or even rural places and stuff that's not the big woods, it's like hunting a mule deer or an elk. It's a different animal. They're not the same animal, really, you know?
Yeah.
The way their habits are, you know? I mean, you're not going to spook off deer up here by being in there. I mean, I don't know how many times I've tracked bucks, and they end up walking down my boot tracks. I remember a lot of times being one of my other buddies would be hunting together muzzleloader season. We're both tracking bucks in the same piece of woods, and my buck's walking in down his tracks, and his buck's walking down my tracks. We compare the stories at the end of the day, like, them bucks will walk right down your boot track. They don't care.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's all real fascinating stuff. I know, you know, I think what we'll have to do at some point is do a part 2 to this, because if I get you started specifically on the tracking, as far as the where you start, the approach, and working through that, that's a whole nother long conversation. And what I kind of wanted to do tonight is just kind of get some, you know, like you started this off saying, if you're not tracking and you're not in the woods and you're not following them around, you're not learning. I've found the guys that know the most and seem to have the most consistently accurate information is the guys that are doing what you're doing, because you're covering ground and you're following deer around and you're doing what they do. And I think it's one of the best resources of information that exists for deer hunting and learning their behavior.
Oh, for sure. When you get on a buck's track, what you're doing is you're living the life of that buck. It's written in the snow, everything he's doing and everywhere he's going. Mm-hmm. It's written down for you. That's what's so cool about it, you know. And that's how you learn. You learn from them. That's like first-hand knowledge, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you've been doing it now for...
let's say going on 40 years now.
That's pretty good.
So, yeah, I've tracked it. I couldn't even tell you how many, but I know it's thousands of bucks over them years, you know.
What does it take for a deer up there to get 200 pounds? Is that could they be 3 years old and be 200 pounds, or do they have to be 4 or 5, or does it vary?
No, usually if they're going to be, they'll be it at 3.5 because they're like, they're all shaped different sizes. There's some bucks even up here that'll never weigh 200. They might be 10 years old and they don't dress 200.
Oh, really?
Because they don't all get, they're just shapes and sizes, like people,
Yeah.
The ones that get, the ones that get the heaviest, you get some of them ones that are, when you get up around the ones that are 250, 260, 270, they got to be long. They got to be tall deer, long.
Sure.
To carry that kind of weight,
Mm-hmm.
I know the one I shot, it was in '89. It was on the cover of my first book. He was 7.5 years old, and he weighed 200 pounds right on the nose. But hanging up on the game pole, he was the same length as a doe. Just thick, real big neck and thick, but just doesn't have the length,
Sure.
Yeah. So they're not all gonna, but if they're gonna be, typically they'll by 3.5 because there's yearling bucks up here. I've seen yearling bucks that dress 155, and 2.5-year-olds will go 185.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there's no correlation really with the antlers on that, is there? I mean, you can have a 200-pound buck with a big rack and a 200-pound buck with a little rack, or is there some type of...
No, there's no correlation. And matter of fact, if you average it out, what I've seen over the years is the bucks that weigh 190 to 210 seem to have the better, on average, will often have a better rack than one that'll weigh 250. It's crazy to think that, but it's the nature of it. And up here, we got a lot of nice. Our bucks up here typically heavy beams.
Yep.
And short tines. They don't typically score that great.
Yeah.
On average, then we get some that score good, but I've only shot one buck in Maine that has scored over 140. Out of all them bucks I've shot over 200, there's only been one that scored 140. Most of the bucks that you shoot here will be 120 to 140 in that range. If you get one over that, you got a bonus,
Yeah, sure. I know you were saying that guy or kid shot a buck that scored 184 inches, and I'm thinking, man, oh man, that's a special deer, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've had my hunters have shot way more better rack bucks than I have over the years. I mean, they wouldn't have got them without me, but it's still I didn't get one of them.
Right.
Yeah, because when you're tracking, you don't always. I go by the track. If I'm on the buck I want to shoot, he's going to get shot. I don't care what his rack is,
Sure.
I got one of them big old buck tracks. Sometimes I get on a track. If it's not, I know it's not I call them either ors. It might be 190 something, or it might be 210. And usually when I see those tracks, I'm going to want to get a look at them before I start pulling the trigger,
Yeah.
But when I get on one of those old big tracks, I don't really care what he's got for a rack because I know he's an old buck,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. When I started listening to your podcast, I really appreciated, that you guys have an appreciation for just an older deer and a heavy weight, something that's not stereotypical of what the television programs have made popular on the farm hunting, and teach their own. If that's what you're into, that's what you're into. But like you said, for me, it was always way more of a challenge to just get up to the big woods and try to get a deer up there. I took more pride in some 1.5-year-old bucks that I've shot up there than the 3.5-year-old bucks that I've shot down in farm country, because they're just harder earned.
Oh, for sure. I tell people that come up here to hunt, if you shot a yearling buck up here, you know, a 1.5-year-old buck up here tracking, that is a far bigger accomplishment than any buck you'll shoot off a stand out in a bean field or something, because you've accomplished something, you know.
Yeah. I can attest to that because I've done both, and it's just a way different feeling. And I've kind of committed my deer season this year to hunting up north, and it can be tough, you know, with the travel time and getting away with the family and getting up there and doing it. But boy, I'm eating up about it. And to be honest with you, you know, it's about a 4-hour commute for me to get up into the North Woods. I haven't hunted downstate here yet this year at all. It's just been getting up there for long weekends as much as I can and hunting up there. I love it so much.
Yeah, for sure. Same here. I've been invited to go many times out to different places in Iowa and all the places guys have invited me, and I don't even want to waste the time doing it because I'm not interested, you know.
I do know. I've been invited to do the same things, and it looks fun. I would never. I'm sure I would never have a bad time going on a deer hunt, but there's just something different about going up to those tracks of big forest, and I don't know. They're the kind of places that feel like anything's possible, and you just never know what's going to be around the next corner. And I guess I like the adventure in that as well, as much as the opportunity to shoot a big deer. So
yeah, because I think a lot of it is up here. It's the mystique of seeing a buck that nobody's ever seen, you know.
Yes.
You just never know what you're going to see. Like that one that was 184, you know, we never would in my wildest dreams would have expected a buck like that would have come out of there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm hopeful for at some point. I've shot a 200 pound buck, and it was probably 16 years ago, and I haven't shot another one since. It's a hard accomplishment to do. So,
well, you know, I'm going to tell you that a lot of that too is if where you're hunting, there probably isn't that many of them bucks.
Right. No, there's not at all.
Right. So that's what I tell people. There's a lot of guys from Maine that live in eastern Maine or southern Maine and complain because they've never shot a buck over 200. And I said, you're probably never going to if you keep hunting down there, because you know all of Maine doesn't have the big bucks. It's the north in Maine. It's a line about, and it's just my theory on it, and I think it's probably right, because southern Maine borders New Hampshire and stuff, and the southern half of the state is forested different. You know, you've got your oak, you got your hemlock, and that type of stuff. It's not the northern boreal forest. And northern Maine and very northern New Hampshire and up into Quebec and New Brunswick is that boreal forest, which means spruce fir forest.
Right.
And I remember when I was a kid, I got a book by Leonard Lee Rue. It was a Game Animals of North America, and I never forgot it. There was 23 subspecies of white-tailed deer or something like that, 20-something.
Yeah.
And the northern boreal forest was the biggest ones. And it was because of the northern latitudes and the survival of the winter and the cold and the snow. They genetically had to get bigger to survive.
Sure.
So even in central Maine, when you get down out of here into central Maine, a dressed 200-pound buck is probably not more than 1 out of every 100 bucks tagged, maybe less.
Wow.
In my town, you know what it is, and it's been that way since I've been here. Pretty much you can count on it every year. 1 out of 6.
Okay.
So if there's 1 out of 6 bucks tagged over 200 pounds, your odds are a heck of a lot better of getting one here than southern Maine, right?
No kidding.
Yeah, you got to hunt where they are, you know.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed watching those guys up in Saskatchewan. They that subspecies of deer up there is sort of similar, I believe, to what you're talking about, right? They're just big bodied deer. They might not have the giant pretty racks, but boy, they
Yeah,
look like a mule deer.
yeah, same thing. They've developed, and those deer aren't boreal or forest deer because then they don't. It's not really where they are. But those deer, I believe, because I hunted quite a bit in northwest Ontario, which borders Saskatchewan, no, Manitoba, I guess. But those deer, I think, are the ones that migrated north up out of Dakotas and Minnesota and stuff.
Okay.
Because the reason I say I think they're a different deer is because the feet on them are smaller.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're not the same. These feet we got on our bucks out here are totally different than most of the ones anywhere else. I've hunted a lot of places, and once in a while you'll find one of those big tracks out in northwest Ontario, but most of them, I mean, you could kill a great big buck with a Boone and Crockett rack on it, and he might have a foot on it the size of a good-sized doe back here,
Sure.
Yeah. So it's some different subspecies of deer, that's all. But, yeah, they get big, but they have to. Those, as they move north, they had only the strongest survived up there, too,
Right. Right. Well, hell, this has all been great information, and if you wouldn't mind at some point, I'd like to follow up with you and do maybe another one of these where we could dive specifically into tracking as far as like where you start, the gear you choose, and all that. Here at some point would be great. But tonight was a
Yeah.
great conversation, great information, and I know you guys are having these conversations in detail. You're doing it every week now. You guys have your own podcast and you've written a couple books. I assume all that can be found through your Big Woods Bucks website, right?
Yeah, bigwoodsbucks.com, pretty easy. And then our podcast has the same logo. It's a Big Woods Bucks podcast. It's easy enough to find it's on all the iTunes, Stitcher, all of that stuff. It's easy to find. Plus, people that aren't techie, it's right on the website too. We put them on the website too.
That's great. Are you guys currently doing any of the guiding for whitetail hunts? If guys ever wanted to try to come up and do this style of stuff, is that something you're still providing?
Yeah, some of the team members are doing it now, but starting next year, I'm going to get back into it. So I'm going to start booking hunts, and some of my team members they've agreed that they'd like to guide some hunters. So we'll probably do it probably most of them would be like one-on-one hunts because most people are going to want to learn how to track and stuff, So, yes, so we'll be doing that for next year for sure.
What type of time frame are guys looking at if they wanted to go on a hunt in the fall that they would need to obviously they're not waiting until a week before and calling you, right? Or how does that work?
Well, most of it will be booking up through the winter months, Usually by spring, most of it's booked up, or at least all the best spots, the last couple weeks of the season or whatever. So,
sure.
Yeah, it'll, even when I had my other outfitting business, we always had most everything booked up pretty early,
Sure. Yeah, well, I'd love the opportunity to come do that at some point in time, and I'll definitely be thinking about that and potentially reaching out to you to do so because to me that sounds like a heck of an experience that I would never forget, and I'd be really interested in doing something like that. So,
yeah, sounds good.
Okay, Hal. Well, I appreciate your time this evening, and we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. I enjoyed it. good luck to all you Michigan guys out there.
Yeah, our gun season's opening here in a couple weeks, and I know everybody's, well, I am. I'm chomping at the bit. Boy, I can't wait, because for me, like you said, that November 15th, that for me is when it's as lively as it's going to get all season, and I don't look forward to anything as much as I do that week. So.
Right.
Okay, Hal, well, thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay.
Yep, bye.
Bye.